Just to quickly review, we will be using the Land Trust Standards and Practices as a reference and guide for this series, and Rob has placed the text of the Standards and Practices in the shared Google Drive that he distributed to you all last week. The Standards and Practices provide an operating framework for land trusts, and most importantly, a common language for us to talk about our work. The Standards and Practices were last updated in 2017, and they consist of 12 standards, the first 7 of which apply to all nonprofit organizations, and the latter half of which are particular to land conservation. So they shake down into 4 topical areas that we will refer to as buckets. And these are governance, which is the subject of tonight's talk, financial management, and those 2 correspond to the first half of the standards. The third bucket is land protection, also known as acquisitions or land acquisitions, land transactions, and the fourth is land stewardship. So Land Trust Board service, as we began to review last week, also often entails more than just sitting in a boardroom, right? We touched last week on the distinction between volunteer work that's related to the governance of an organization and volunteer work that relates to carrying out the activities of the organization. Nonprofit boards have a legal duty to provide oversight and governance, including developing an organizational mission, using plans, budgets, and policies to manage activities consistent with that mission, raising the funds that are necessary to implement those plans and budgets, overseeing the use of funds and resources in a transparent and responsible manner, and ensuring the board's long-term sustainability in perpetuity, all things that we will talk about tonight. But for many land trusts, board members do a lot more than this. In particular, smaller organizations with few or no staff. Board members may negotiate land deals, help monitor properties, blaze trails, lead interpretive hikes, and on, but these activities are not the main job of the board. They're personnel activities, which could be performed by other volunteers, paid contractors, or staff. Put another way, the distinction between volunteer or unpaid work and staff paid work is less important than the difference between your board work, which is governance and management, and your personnel work, which is everything else. Most of us got involved because we enjoy the personnel part. Let's be honest. Doing stewardship work, educational and community activities, hiking, but the governance work is essential to keeping the organization going in perpetuity. So tonight we're going into that boardroom. Our later sessions on land protection and stewardship will provide insight into the work required to do deals and manage properties for those of you who will be doing that work or who want to know more about how others are doing that in your organization. But tonight's material is important for every board member to know and to appreciate. Rob, are you keeping an eye on the chat? Will you alert me to any questions that we should stop for? Okay, thank you. So board members have a real legal and fiduciary duty to provide oversight of operations and finance. And those duties are expressed in terms that might seem like layman's terms, but are actually terms of art used in lawsuits and claims against nonprofit boards. And before you get too nervous about that, please be assured that nonprofit board members are offered statutory protections so long as they carry out these duties in good faith. In addition, most organizations offer further protections against liability through indemnity clauses in their bylaws, as well as by purchasing directors and officers insurance to protect directors from having out-of-pocket expenses incurred in the defense of claims. The duty of care here on the left uses a prudent person standard to hold board members responsible for knowing what's going on in their organizations and exercising actual governance through discussion and decision making, for being engaged and involved, in other words. Stay informed, go to meetings, and note that in order to exercise this duty of care, board members can have the expectation that they will be provided with the information that they need in order to do this. The duty of loyalty in the middle here means that the director must take action and make decisions in the best interest of the organization and no other entity, including themselves. So this duty requires us to demote other interests that we might have personally or in connection with other organizations to the interests of the organization that one is serving as a board member on. So for example, and you know this, if a director would really love their neighbor's vacant property to be conserved, but it doesn't have particular conservation value, it's not proper to try and convince the land trust to conserve it. So we'll talk more about how the duty of loyalty intersects with an organization handling conflicts of interest later on this hour. The duty of obedience here over on the right-hand side keeps boards aligned with the organization's stated mission and vision, preventing them from going too far afield in their actions, even if they have a public benefit and come from a well-meaning place. So, for example, an organization with a mission to protect farmland would probably not sponsor a recreational dog park. If an organization finds themselves in this position, often where they want to do things that stray a little far from their mission, it might be appropriate to look at the strategic plan and assess whether there's need for a shift in direction. What this slide depicts is that there are 4 practice components to Standard 1, and I'll touch on each briefly. Ethics, first in the top left. Being part of a tax-exempt organization is the promise to cause a public good, and that requires us to uphold high standards of ethics in our business practice. Pretty simple. On the bottom left, community engagement requires thoughtfulness with respect to the public that we serve. We should be aware of who our stakeholders are, and they might encompass a pretty broad group, or they could be a small and distinct community. They could exist now or in the future. They could be human or animal. They could be all of the above. But keeping your stakeholders in mind, this practice inspires us to build the relationships necessary to deliver the most authentic service to them. So several of you expressed your concerns last week about engaging more diverse people in land trust work and broadening public service to include historically marginalized populations. Standard 1 reminds us right from the get-go that we may be about the land, but we serve people. I'll take the right-hand side of this slide together. So mission, vision, and strategic direction, and your strategic plan. Many organizations have a written strategic plan, but it's actually the process that is almost more important. Strategic plans are produced as the outcome of inclusive working sessions to look at stakeholder needs, organizational strengths and weaknesses, and opportunities in the community. And they should be produced by the full board together. So if they eventually derive to a written strategic plan, that's great, but don't shortcut the process, just in order to get to something that looks nice on a shelf. It is the buy-in from the board that is really important. Strategic plans tend to cover 5 years, although for some they're shorter or longer, 3, maybe 10. You might have heard about strategic plans that articulate a BHAG or a big, hairy, audacious goal. That was all the rage a couple of years ago. That can be a really exciting motivator and a vision, but while out-of-the-box brainstorming can be a helpful component of strategic planning, the eventual plans don't have to take the organization off on a new path. While inspiring, they don't have to be vastly different from other organizations' plans or from plans that existed before, and their goals should be attainable. For land trusts, they're usually going to include goals in the areas of land protection, stewardship, programs, communications, fundraising, and organizational capacity. And then from the strategic plan derives the annual work plan. So the annual work plan flows from the strategic plan. It's focused on implementation and outlines the activities to be undertaken in the coming year. It's most helpful if this aligns with the fiscal year to the extent that one's fiscal year is not the calendar year. And it might cover regular annual business activities such as board recruitment or your audit or financial review, but it's also going to cover activities that are specific to that year, such as your planned programs, land protection projects, land management activities, such as installing a trail, so activities that you wouldn't repeat year in, year out, and any special fundraising campaigns or events. Something to note is that the annual work plan in a staffed organization is going to be something that, for the most part, the staff are going to carry out. In an all-volunteer land trust, the annual work plan is going to be something that perhaps board committees or individuals on the board will attend to. The work plan should coordinate with the budget and the fundraising plan. So I like to compare it to a three-legged stool, because without each of these components, the work plan won't stand. So each item on the work plan, if there's a cost associated with it, should be reflected in the budget, and then budgeted income for the year from fundraising should, of course, be calibrated and planned so that you can cover the needed costs that are in the budget, right? So you have the strategic plan outlines kind of a long-term forecast. The annual work plan shows what you're going to do during the course of 1 year in order to move forward on those goals. Okay, standard 2, and then we're going to stop for some questions, deals with compliance with laws. And this includes incorporation in the organization's state of operation and making annual filings with the Secretary of State. It also includes obtaining tax-exempt status, that's over on the right-hand side, from the federal government, and that's done by application to the IRS. Status as a public charity with the IRS allows the organization to accept donations for which donors may claim a charitable deduction, and furthermore exempts that organization from paying taxes. And the IRS issues a letter, often needed to demonstrate this status. It can be really helpful for board members to know where to get a copy of that letter. But for the most part, if you're coming in at the midpoint of an organization, it's going to be fine with respect to its incorporation and its tax-exempt status. An annual tax filing made out on IRS Form 990, which we'll talk much more about in the financial management session, demonstrates to the IRS that the organization is operating as a public charity in its expenditures and its receipt of donations. Over here on the left-hand side, bottom, nonprofit organizations must adopt bylaws which direct how the organization operates procedurally, including whether the organization has members, and if so, their meeting and voting rights, how many directors that organization has and how they're elected, how meetings are conducted, delegation of work to standing and ad hoc committees, officers and their responsibilities, and the indemnification of directors, which we talked about in connection with your fiduciary duties. And then finally, standard 2 involves compliance with federal laws that prohibit tax-exempt organizations from engaging in certain activities. And these include not engaging in private annulment, which is a term of art that means that as a board member, you cannot receive a share of the profits or the proceeds from the organization, right? So it's a conflict of interest related thing, where as board members, you're not meant to profit from your service in any way. Tax-exempt organizations also cannot confer an impermissible private benefit, which again is a term of art that basically means as an organization, you're meant to confer a broad public benefit in your actions and not disproportionately benefit any one private person in your actions. As a nonprofit, a tax-exempt organization, you're not allowed to engage in political campaigning. So if you invite one candidate to your event, then you should invite the other candidates as well. And especially around election time, be really cautious in offering a platform to any candidates for office. There are furthermore limitations on lobbying for tax-exempt organizations. For the most part, grassroots advocacy is fine. But if your organization is looking to spend a significant amount of money, of its annual budget on advocacy, you should really check into how to make sure that you stay within the law of tax exempt organizations and don't endanger your status. Okay, so we're going to stop now. For any questions that you might have had so far, whether about the duties of care, loyalty, and obedience, strategic planning, corporate compliance issues. Strategic planning was on a lot of your minds last week when we did the Menti exercise. And there were also a few questions about insurance. And I did want to say that we'll do more discussion about insurance during the financial management section. If you have questions about legal liability that's related to your board service or the operation of directors and officers insurance and how that works, we could talk about that a bit too. So why don't we stop for, up to 5 minutes to see what your questions might be.
Again, you can either use the raise hand or just make a note in the chat that you have a question.
I saw where you said if you invite one politician, you had to invite the other one. We have a politician who wants to join our board. Is that a no-no or a membership or anything? Just keep him a membership, or would
So
having
that's tricky. I wouldn't say that if you have one that you have to have one from every party, but it could, depending on the state of politics in your area, I can see it, raising some issues that you want to be aware of and just keep an eye on, particularly during that person's candidacy if they're up for re-election. You want to make doubly sure that that person, I don't know, personally, I would have that person let go during that time and not really be the main mouthpiece for your organization. I think it's going to be really difficult if you do have that person on your board to seem like you're not endorsing them in some way, but you should really be cautious about whether or not your actions could be perceived as an endorsement, and be aware that there could be, extra scrutiny applied to you during that time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, person from the Down East Coastal Conservancy.
Hi, I have a question about the annual work plan in a very small land trust. Who would be ultimately responsible for the development of that work plan? Who would you hold responsible, accountable, et cetera?
So for a very small land trust that was doing most of its work, where the board members are really most responsible for the personnel work, I happen to think that it relates really well to the committees. And so you might try a system where each committee takes a look at the strategic plan and the areas of the strategic plan that they're responsible for and lays out, it can even be just a series of bullets, but lays out the different things that that committee thinks they can accomplish and work on over the course of the coming year in order to make progress on the strategic plan. So committees would be one way to do it. If the board is so small that it's not using committees, another way of doing it would just be having the people who are primarily responsible for certain functions, especially as they align to your strategic plan, have those people build the work plan. It's not a bad idea to have your board adopt the work plan so that everyone gets a chance to see it and see what different people and different committees within the organization say they're going to do. And that can also, of course, bolster accountability. And at the end of the year, you'd review it, and you'd review it against your strategic plan, and you'd make a new one for the next year. So that is it's a really good way of staying on target with your work.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a question in the chat about, well, I just lost the first question. There was a question about pro bono resources, legal resources. And I think that can help with like doing bylaws. And I think that's going to vary state to state, but usually there are nonprofit service centers that can offer some assistance or templates or advice around doing your bylaws. And so that would be something that, depending on what state your organization is, I would go to the people like Rob, who are Rob, Amanda, and Whit, who are providing you with services in your state. And thanks, Rob, for posting the Lawyers Clearinghouse. So there was one more question,
It's from Karen, and it's in Grafton, and it's about any suggestions for getting a board engaged and motivated to do a strategic plan. Like, what would be how to convince people that it's worth their time?
It's tough because, in an organization that's busy, it's really, and with boards who have busy other lives, it can be really difficult to get around to strategic planning. Everyone agrees it's a good idea, we should do it, but somehow it gets shunted to the side. What I can say, having worked with a number of organizations on strategic plans recently, is that there's been a lot of development in the land trust world, especially over the course of these past several years, as we've been dealing with COVID and increased, user awareness of public access and social justice issues. And, there's kind of been an evolution to our work that bears some reconsideration and reflection on, why it is that we all are still committed and so committed to our organization. So if you, as an organization, take even the smallest amount of time to start pulling back and reflecting on, what's new, what's different, what is kind of one of the organizing principles of our work, what are we aligning towards, and developing some of this common understanding of what the organization is working towards and where the lines of agreement are among the board, that it can really help you in figuring out who you're going to recruit to come on for leadership transitions. It can help to make your work seem more organized so that the transactions that you're pursuing and the programs that you're doing are all kind of united by this common thread, not just done because, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And so, I will say that while it can be really hard to find the time, it's absolutely beneficial, even if you find a little bit of time, for the board to discuss what they're observing in terms of trends in our work, what that means for your organization and community, and how that's going to steer and direct your organization in the years to come. All right, I think
Okay,
we
thanks.
need to move on.
Yep.
So, so I'm gonna, you keep your questions coming in chat, and I'm gonna reshare so that we can move.
I also just want to put in a vote for encouraging people to comment in the chat window as well. If you feel like you have something to add to something that somebody said, feel free and offer your own thoughts.
Okay, so moving on to standard 3, this is where we get into the real meat of board service. And this standard outlines the board's responsibility for program oversight, ensuring financial health, and ensuring the organization's current and future stability by investing in itself. Note that for organizations with staff, an important way of overseeing programs is through oversight of any executive staff, who would in turn then be responsible for overseeing the remaining staff, right? So if you have an executive director, it's the board's job to review the performance of that executive director, and then to allow the executive director the ability to do the same for her staff or his staff or their staff. Included within the oversight of financial health and sustainability are the board's responsibility to adopt the annual budget, to fundraise, to meet operating needs, to review periodic reports that are relevant to financial management, including understanding what assets of the organization are available for operating expenses as opposed to restricted for other purposes. And so these periodic reports that are provided to you as a board should be appropriate to the scale of the organization. And sometimes that means monthly or during every board meeting. But it could, for a small organization with not many transactions, be quarterly or biannually, or maybe even on a different schedule if your cash flow tends to follow a trajectory that means that there wouldn't be much to report in the early portion of your year. It's the board's responsibility to review the annual audit or financial statements and to review and authorize the filing of the IRS Form 990 tax return. Although in most cases, the bulk of the work on this is done within a finance and/or audit committee or by the treasurer, and they then bring recommendations to the board. The board should make and follow policies as to the investment of and management of funds, so reserve funds. And then finally, the board should adopt and implement policies and procedures to limit risks of misappropriation or misuse of organizational funds, otherwise known as internal controls. And we'll talk more about that next week during the financial session. Here on the right, note that it's the board's job to make sure that it's able to do its work, right? Which means ensuring that it has a sufficient number of members who have sufficient skills and attributes. And this means paying attention to needs for recruitment and communicating to prospective and current board members the expectations for their service through a job description or some kind of a board responsibilities document. The board should arrange for orientation and training to help newly elected directors do their jobs. And there should be some method of periodically evaluating the service of individual board members as well as the functioning of the board as a whole. So that doesn't mean that there needs to be the same kind of evaluation process as you would do for staff. But even if like once a year, the board chair takes the time to say, let's reflect on our board service. Are we serving on the right committees? Are we having an impact, on the functioning of this organization? Are there any shifts that need to be made in terms of how we're working together? This is really going to help you plan for transitions also, as some directors retire or change offices and committees. Speaking of offices, the board can and usually does apportion responsibilities among officers who are usually elected by the board, and they can include the president or the chair, who's responsible for coordination of the board and the organization, a treasurer responsible for financial matters, and the secretary responsible for minutes and records. There might be vice presidents or other officers who back up these people. The board also might delegate some functions to standing or ad hoc committees that I referred to earlier. These might include a finance committee, a governance committee, land protection typically, stewardship, communications, fundraising, or other committees that are special and limited in time and responsibilities. It's a good idea to have a written description of these committees, whether this description's within the bylaws or as a separate board document. And one final note for you on executive committees, which are used in some organizations. They're generally made up of the officers, and they facilitate needs between board meetings. But what I want to say is that because nonprofit boards are meant to be democratic, and the duty of care assumes your involvement in all of the decision making, the executive committee, like other committees, should be bringing recommendations to the board, but not taking action on its own unless action must be taken before a board meeting can be convened. So just be cautioned against this and against the executive committee kind of predetermining not only what items need to be discussed at a board meeting, but also what they believe the outcome should be. Rather, take the time to engage the full board in a robust discussion so that decision is the true outcome of a democratic process. And if it's necessary for the executive committee to take action between meetings, what the committee should be doing is letting the board know immediately that it did take that action. And it's even a good idea to ratify the action at the next regular board meeting. Okay, so that was a lot. We're going to take another minute just to check in on any questions about Standard 3 and board functioning. I wanted to mention that in the Menti slide from last week's session, there was a question about how board meetings should be managed and run. And at a minimum, board meetings should always have an agenda, which is compiled and sent out prior to the meeting. Most people like to say at least 3 days prior would be a good, that would be an adequate amount of time for board members to review the agenda and material. The agenda should be supplemented by documents that are important to the business before the board. So generally, you're going to get minutes from the prior meeting that are to be approved. You might get regular reports like the financial reports I was mentioning, reports on programs and activities, supplemental documentation for discussion and decision making. So if you were doing a land protection deal, for example, you would expect to get maps, photographs, and different descriptive documentation about the property that's under consideration. It can be helpful during a board meeting to have different people responsible for conducting the discussion throughout the meeting. So committee chairs, for example, might be delegated the responsibility of leading that portion of the meeting. I guess that's all I have about that note. But there were also lots of comments about avoiding burnout and building capacity on the board and board succession. So I wanted to call attention, you might be aware that there's a series of workshops that are currently being offered by the Land Trust Alliance on the topic of board succession. And I've been sitting in on those. They've been really great. I hope they're going to be offered again. But in case they're not, the Alliance has also offered a few webinars on this subject, which would be recorded and available for viewing on the Land Trust Alliance's website or the Learning Center.
There are a couple questions in the chat there, Connie. And Barbara has her hand raised.
All right, go ahead, Barbara.
Okay, my question was actually also in the chat. You mentioned that the board is responsible to do an annual independent audit. And my question is that a legal requirement or is that a best practice?
Right, so no, that's a really good question. Does your board have to do some kind of an independent review? And the answer to that, in terms of legal is no. There may be statewide statutory requirements to get an audit in connection with the receipt of state funding above a certain amount. And for accredited organizations, there are requirements that are keyed to the organization's level of annual income. So the requirement to get either an audit, a review, or a compilation is dependent on the organization's level of annual income. But I would say, even as an organization that doesn't do it every year, consider doing it every period of so many years, because having that kind of independent review is healthy for an organization, in terms of financial sustainability, on the one hand, but also tremendously reassuring to donors, and something that donors considering a large donation might ask you if in the process of vetting the organization.
I guess that leads me to a second question, because actually I'm fairly familiar with independent audits. I ran a nonprofit agency that had a $31 million annual budget, so I was pretty familiar with extremely expensive and very thorough annual audits. So we don't even hit the threshold in our land trust for the bigger 990 filing. We do the shorter one. So are there auditing firms that would really audit a little? I mean, an organization with less than 100,000. I don't even know if we have $50,000. Are they going to audit us? I
I think
mean,
you
what do
could
they,
probably do an audit, and it might be more expensive than you would want, and is warranted, given the level of transactions that the organization is doing. However, you could get something less than an audit. So you could contract for a financial review or a compilation, which, may not be quite as valuable in terms of the feedback that you're getting from the reviewer, but at least would provide some assurance to a donor and also to you as a board that an independent CPA has checked out your books.
Mhm. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. And thank you for the comments from other folks.
Great. Are there any other questions before we move on? I got a little bit behind schedule, so I want to make sure that we keep it moving.
I see Stephen Caulfield has his hand up, and there's one other little question in the chat as well. Oh, you muted yourself again, accidentally. There you go.
The comment that how do you engage the board in strategic planning? My observation is that if there are external forces that are significant, it's fairly easy to get the board engaged in thinking things through. For example, the whole COVID experience has changed people's relationships to the outdoors. And the need for programming, I think, is dramatically increased as we have a significant cultural shift in the country. The same with global warming. It's a large external factor, but a factor that would drive us to think carefully about our strategic plan and how it might link up with plans for ecological preservation that will in some way mitigate against global warming. And then the third thing is occasionally towns and other governmental jurisdictions review their open lands programs. And that's an ideal time to engage the board in strategic planning. So I think looking externally for energy is a good way to think about engaging the board in strategic plans.
Okay, thank you. Great ideas.
I agree. All right, Rob, are we good with moving on, or do we want to take one more from the chat? Or
maybe a quick one in the chat is like board size. Do you have thoughts on ideal board size or what's too big?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think that personally, I think it could be really difficult to get your work done if you had an extremely small board, although there are boards that operate with 3 or 4 people. But I would say, like for me, my comfort level would be, not below 7. And I also think that boards can get really unwieldy if they get too large. And I've seen boards operate really effectively, with up to 25 people, depending on, the composition of the board, the camaraderie within the board, and the way that it's structured with committees. So I don't really have, a set recommendation on that. And I think that it really depends on the organization. But, when you've crossed the line and it's gotten too big. And it's just fine, by the way, to have a board that is, to have committees, I should say, that have non-board members on it. In fact, that can be a really good way of vetting people who may be appropriate for board service or may not be willing to ever be on your board, but want to be helpful in other ways. And so, just because somebody is interested in your organization and could be really useful to your work doesn't mean necessarily that they need to be a board member. So just keep that in mind. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to move on to Standard 4, which is about conflicts of interest. Standard 4 is really important, and it's about the board's responsibility to guard against conflicts of interest that might influence the board's decision-making. And all nonprofit organizations should have a conflict of interest policy that specifies that conflicts will be avoided or managed so that undue influence won't corrupt their decisions, decisions that should be based solely on the best interests of the organization. The important thing here to note is that it's about the management of the conflict, not whether there is one. Conflicts themselves are not inherently bad. Conflicts of interest can be tricky to manage, however, not the least because it's easy to feel defensive about them. But in fact, they're not at all unusual in a nonprofit organization and in land trusts in particular, and they do not by themselves signify any bad intentions. So how your organization handles conflicts goes a long way towards showing organizational integrity and helps to avoid the risk of IRS scrutiny, the loss of tax-exempt status, or liability claims for breach of your duty of loyalty. So in the end, don't shy away from recognizing and trying to manage conflicts. It's all about issue spotting. There are a couple of ways that conflicts with board members might arise within your organization. Sometimes you might hire a board member or that board member's family member or their employer to provide services to the organization that are not services that are endemic to board service. You might, as an organization, be considering a conservation easement on a board member's property or on property that's adjacent to the board member's home. You could be undertaking stewardship activities on a board member's previously protected property, or otherwise be dealing with something that might provide some impact to a board member's property. So maybe a board member lives adjacent to a preserve. And when that board member stands to benefit from your intervention, you want to be able to manage the conflict. So if you're able to identify that there is a conflict, you can usually take steps to remove the risk that conflicting interests will infect the organization's decision and make it clear through documentation that there's no undue influence and no private enormement and no impermissible private benefit. So the steps that you would take include making the board aware of the conflicted person's interest, removing that person from the board's discussion and vote on the matter, and other steps that ensure that the organization is getting the outcome that's best suited to its interests. So that might include benchmarking. Be aware that there may be people outside of the board who are in a position to exercise influence, such as major donors, prominent local or political leaders, others with information or a relationship to the organization that is unlike that of the general public. And although these people don't usually participate in board meetings and votes, you should still be on the lookout for whether or not their influence could impact decision-making and try to take steps to avoid that if possible. Always document the actions taken to mitigate a conflict so there's a good record to back up any questions about managing the conflict. And this might be, by noting recusals within board minutes, or, depending on the nature of the conflict, might even warrant a separate memorandum that details how you benchmarked and provided for arm's length negotiations in conjunction with a conflict of interest. This slide outlines some of the significant parts of an organization's conflict of interest policy. Usually the policy will define who's covered. We call them insiders. It mandates that disclosure and physical recusal from the board meeting. And really it's important that the person actually leaves the room, because we all know that whether or not they speak, they still, through their body language and their facial expressions, could convey some influence. So the best practice is to make the person actually leave during discussion and voting. The conflict of interest policy would outline some means and steps to mitigating a conflict, require documentation of the conflict. And usually there's a clause in the policy itself that prohibits loans to board members, which would constitute private enormement, and prohibits board members for receiving compensation for duties that are endemic to their board service. Most organizations use like an annual form that board members sign about the conflict of interest, but be aware that this would not absolve you from daylighting the conflict at the time that it occurs and the board begins to discuss a conflicted transaction. Okay, let me get to my, okay. So I'm just going to pause here for any questions about conflicts.
Great question in the chat about staff attending board meetings or committee meetings.
About whether or not they should?
Yeah, I think that's, what's the thought about them doing so?
You know, generally, I think it's helpful for staff to be in board meetings, but they should, staff should not be present for discussion on compensation or other, you know, and if it's clear that staff have a conflict of interest, like always err on the side of removing a conflicted person from a discussion, right? So I guess, you know, maybe if there is, I don't know that this is necessarily a conflict, but if there's a disagreement in terms of strategic direction and activities of the land trust between the board and the staff, that would be, to me, more of like an interpersonal issue, working out, you know, those differences and aligning both staff and board with the strategic plan and the mission, as opposed to a conflict of interest. But conversations about salary, compensation, extension of contract, annual evaluation, those all should be done without the presence of the staff, you know, for whom that conversation is about. I see that Peter has his hand raised.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the recommended process for if vetting or adjudicating or at least analyzing conflicts that have been brought to light. As you get a form, it mentions potential conflict. Is that something that the board then reviews on an annual basis? Are there designated people for doing that? Is there a process for understanding the nature of those conflicts and what sort of action is necessary or not necessary and who conducts it?
So if a board member discloses that they have a relationship with an organization that might give rise to a conflict of interest, that would be a good thing for somebody in the organization, whether that be like the governance committee chair or somebody on the executive committee, to note, just to be, I mean, if somebody goes to the trouble of filling out the form and actually acknowledging that on the form, then, you know, it would be useful for that to be read and noted. But that would only be an advisory type thing, you know, unless there were an active transaction under consideration that involved that actual conflict. So, you know, really the time that you would, like, to me, those annual forms are fine, but to me, their biggest value is reminding the board each and every year that, hey, we have a conflict of interest policy and you should look at it and make sure that you know what it says and what your responsibility is if you are somebody who could be considered an insider that has a conflict of interest, right? So it's almost like it's a good way of getting the conflict of interest policy back before the board, like, you know, under their eyes, at least annually, to help them make sure that they continue to issue spot and bring these conflicts to light as they arise.
But not everyone sees conflicts exactly the same way. So the individual raises it. Some people are uncomfortable with it. The individual says, I don't see it as a particular conflict. Is that something that requires a full board vote or decision on it? Is it something that the executive committee can take up? What's the recommended process for deciding how to move forward under a less than obvious situation?
Usually that's laid out in one's conflict of interest policy. So the process and the people who are responsible for considering a conflict of interest is written within the conflict of interest policy, and it may differ depending on the organization. You know, to me, err on the side of caution always. So, you know, if you can if you can get a quorum and get a vote on something that doesn't require the insider to vote, take the insider out. I mean, that's, I think that conflicts get messy because people feel defensive, and there isn't anything wrong with having a conflict of interest. There is something very wrong with abusing one's insider status to influence a decision. So I think the more that people can feel comfortable with the fact that, hey, if I need to stand aside from this decision making, that's just fine, because my board's going to make a decision in the best interest of the organization. And I don't want anyone pointing at the organization and saying that this decision was corrupt because I participated, because I insisted in participating on it. So that would be my suggestion with respect to conflicts of interest, is not to get defensive over it, but to make sure that the organization, really is able to be transparent and, to present their decision as a decision that was truly made in the best interest of the organization. All right, I'm going to move us along. We don't have that much more to cover, but I do want to make sure that we cover it, and we've only got 4 minutes. So this is the nature of trying to do this in 1 hour bites. Okay. Standard 5 is about fundraising, and the standards and practices cover fundraising from the standpoint of what legal and regulatory compliance might be needed, not really an organization's specific methods of or success in fundraising. So the things that the standards and practices cover include state laws that require licensure or registration for organizations that solicit charitable donations, and complying with these rules sometimes requires referring to each state's particular rules on registration. There also are rules that prohibit compensation of fundraising consultants on a commission basis. Fundraising consultants know this, so you're unlikely to get somebody who suggests that, but that's something to be aware of. Within Standard 5 is also the obligation to be accurate in your solicitations, including solicitations that are made for a specific purpose, such as, we're going to build a trail, please, would you support that? Or we'd like to preserve a certain property. So when those solicitations are made for a specific purpose, it's ethically required and statutorily required that we use the money that we've collected for that on that purpose. And we should be accurate in acknowledging these gifts, especially ones that are made for a specific purpose, otherwise known as donor restricted funds. So we'll do a little bit more talking about that during financial management next week. The standards in Standard 5 include taking care to honor donor requests for anonymity, and also being respectful of donor privacy, just overall, and donor information. And then finally, there's this idea that land trusts that might receive property not for conservation, but as non-cash assets that support operations. If this is the case, if you've been offered property as a donation but not for conservation, be sure to be upfront with the donor about the purpose and the intended use of the donation, and document all of that in writing. And then finally, Standard 7 is all about personnel capacity, which could include boards if they're all volunteer organizations, and the need to make sure that the organization has what it needs to do its work, whether through use of staff, contractors, or volunteers. If and when an organization employs staff, the Standard 7 covers having job descriptions and regular performance reviews, which are done again by the board for the executive director and by the executive director for other staff. It covers arranging for appropriate training, paying fair salaries, and implementing personnel policies that are appropriate to the size and scale of the organization and required by law. And then finally, just a note on using contractors. If using contractors, organizations should take care to put the agreement in writing, the form of which might vary. It could be a letter agreement, depending on the size of the contract, or it might be something more that would include an RFP and bidding process for bigger jobs. But in any event, The writing should lay out the schedule for the work, the scope of the work, and the compensation. And the land trust should have a means of ensuring that the contractor is qualified and has the requisite liability and workman's comp insurance. All right, it's 7 o'clock, so I just have one final slide laying out some suggested components for a board manual. So this is a question that I often get, like what should be in the board manual. So there's a handful of policies that are really important given our discussion tonight for all boards to have. And then board manuals generally have some other information about the organization that's helpful for board members to be able to put their hands on at any given time. All right, I think I had Menti slides so that I could solicit your feedback about what was most helpful and what more you needed to know, but I'm gonna, just in the interest of time here, ask you to put those things in the chat. I did, look at the chat from last week. I'll look at it again this week, and I'm available to take a question or two now for those of you who are willing to stay, but also wanted to be able to give you permission to leave if you only budgeted an hour for tonight. I really appreciate your patience and your engagement tonight as we talked about governance, the big subject.
Yeah, so do know that I'll share the chat with Connie afterwards, so feel free and put notes there. You see one, I don't know if you see the one question there now, Connie. Who should drive the board, the ED or the president of the board?
Well, I am an ED, but as much as I'd like to say the ED, the board president should drive the board. That's the job of the board president, to coordinate the board. And so that is often very effectively done in tandem with the executive director. And it would be, to me, it could be potentially problematic if the ED and the board president would differ vastly in the way that they would like to drive the board, but that is the role of the board president.
Tom Nolan has his hand up.
There we go. You are sharing the slides for this, is that right? I wanted to make sure I got that. I don't think our board has a board manual, and I thought that last slide would be particularly valuable for me to take back to them in case they want to know what the heck a board manual is.
Absolutely. I'll be sharing the slides and the recording. I'll let you know when they land in the Google Drive. So I'll send an email probably tomorrow afternoon.
Can I just ask one other request, along that same regard is I serve on a lot of committees, so I'm real big on minutes and, approving of the minutes and sending out an agenda so you have a nice organized meeting and all that kind of stuff. What do you think about that? I mean, if you get a board that says, oh, we never do that, we don't find that necessary, or do you recommend a board follow some kind of a pattern or guide like that?
I do, and not just to keep the meeting orderly, but to create a record of board actions and deliberations, which is meant to be kept in perpetuity. So your board is responsible to meet, to govern, to have minutes that document what was discussed and what actions were taken. And those minutes should be part of your permanent record. So for me, the notice, a reminder of the board meeting at least 7 days in advance, the materials and agenda at least 3 days in advance. It keeps it regular, it keeps it contained and organized. And there are always going to be deviations, but how can a board make decisions if it doesn't have the documentation that it needs, and the information that it needs to really have a full and robust discussion about a matter before it?
It looks like, well, there is another question there, Connie. I don't know, your choice about whether to answer it now or later. How does a board reach compliance on backing up data or protecting data? It's kind of a big question.
Right, so I don't know if that's compliance per se. You do have to, I did just say that you have to keep your board records forever. I think that, technology and the longevity, the duration, perpetual duration of your records is something that is a really important function of an organization. And so in terms of backing up records, well, the standard and the accreditation requirement is that for your really important documents, that you have 2 sets available that you've tested and are sure are protected from inadvertent loss or misplacement or changing or anything like that. And my recommendation would be, as we move to a digital world, that you continually examine what your practices are, so that you can keep at least 2 copies of documents that are your record set or your originals that are protected in such a way that they can't be modified. So an archival PDF or something stronger than that, not something that you could convert back to Word and then reconvert, right? So it's almost like an archival PDF is like a photo, like a scan of a photo, as opposed to when you just take Word and make it a PDF. And so that you have your one set in one place and your second set in a totally different kind of storage, could be a flash drive, could be another cloud space, and that you're always testing to make sure that you're not going to, like what you would do if there was a failure of one or the other of your systems. It's hard to cover that subject in like a minute. There's a lot more to be said about it, but definitely worthy of your focus. And those are some quick tips, about the protection of those documents. And what you don't want is you don't want your records to be in like 5 different board members' basements or in the trunk of their car or flying around somewhere. So centralizing and knowing where those important documents are is really, really important, worth some time and investment for an organization.
I did post a link to the record keeping toolkit on our website, and that we developed with the Land Trust Alliance in coordination with the standards and practices. So I'll send that in the chat, in the email tomorrow as well. All right. Well,
Great.
we may wrap it up just out of respect for everybody's time, and for Connie's in particular. And thank you all for your participation, and we'll continue next week, same bat channel.
Sounds good. See you all next week. Thanks so much.